Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by Carium, the telehealth platform enabling healthcare's digital transformation, helping you care for people within the fabric of their daily lives. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Joe Schmid, Chief Technology Officer at SymphonyRM. Joe, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here, Matt.
So, Joe, what I always like to do with my guests before really getting going with the discussion is to allow my guests the opportunity to provide a little bit more of an introduction as to who they are and what they do. So the floor is yours.
Oh, great. So I have a technical background, studied computer science, and most of my career has been in software engineering. Much of that has been in Silicon Valley startups, originally in speech recognition and mobile computing technology. And then really the last decade, I've been focused on what I call machine learning powered products. So about 10 years ago, did a startup using machine learning for fraud detection, where we stopped credit card takeovers at big banks like JP Morgan Chase and American Express. And then for the last 5 years here at SymphonyRM, focused on bringing machine learning and AI to healthcare.
So is SymphonyRM your first foray into the healthcare industry then?
It is.
So what attracted you to make that transition into the industry?
Yeah, so it was an interesting time where we had done this work on machine learning for fraud detection. It was a really fun use case where we could stop bad guys trying to take over people's credit cards. And I can remember sitting in a conference room where the former FBI director or FBI person was leading fraud at a big bank. And we were showing them the same person calling in over and over and taking over credit card accounts. And it was a really eye-opening use case and a big impact. And then that company that we were at got acquired, and we had a few years of incentives to stick around, and those kind of expired. And some old friends of mine that I had worked with years ago back in Silicon Valley were looking at opportunities in healthcare, and we thought there was a big opportunity to bring some of that machine learning technology into healthcare in kind of a patient engagement type context. So they were looking at use cases. They had an early customer in Intermountain, and it seemed like a big opportunity that I was really excited to go pursue with them. So
kind of with that transition into healthcare and the machine learning background, what avenues are you currently working on, and where do you see the most opportunity for development?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's huge potential for AI in healthcare, as we all know. A lot of people initially think about clinical use cases, and there are high-profile ones like imaging studies where you use machine learning models to detect cancer at better rates than humans in some cases, and exciting things like that. Our take is there are some even lower hanging fruit that you could move faster on, or maybe there's more near-term opportunity. For us, we're huge fans of patient engagement and the opportunity to bring technology to better proactively engage your patients. I think healthcare has been sitting on a lot of rich data, and due to challenges in the industry and other areas of focus, they're a little bit behind in where other industries are. And we think there's big potential to catch up, especially in this proactive outreach use case.
So when you're talking about proactive outreach, what does that actually include?
Yeah, so we think about it as, especially for our health system clients. So these are providers that have electronic medical records that they've been building up over years. And that data is really rich. It includes things like lab results and medication history, procedures and diagnoses, vitals. So really rich data. And right from the start, our vision was that data would be very predictive about things that are relevant to patients across many different service lines. So to make it concrete, it's things like, are certain patients good candidates for bariatric services or orthopedics or cancer screenings, or even more mundane things like annual wellness visits. And through our work analyzing EMR data, I think our vision and our hypothesis have been borne out that data really is predictive. And now we can go put it into practice, meaning we can help health systems do outreach to patients and say, we think you're an especially good candidate for this type of cancer screening, or we have these great bariatric services, and we have some great educational material, and really drive much more proactivity. I think the industry as a whole has been traditionally more on the reactive side, and there's a great trend and a lot more interest in being much more proactive and using data to drive those outreach strategies.
No, yeah, that description that you were just giving of that proactive outreach and really trying to be, I think as you were saying, predictive around upcoming or pending needs, as you said, seems to definitely align with that shift into a more value-based care world within healthcare. Since from that perspective, you're looking to help get in front of conditions as opposed to, as you mentioned, being more of a reactive system that it's traditionally been.
Yeah, and we've worked in both models. We have absolutely clients that are in the full value-based care ACO world. One of our clients on the East Coast, Griffin, has fully adopted that model. And so the kind of things we support them on are preventative care, care gap closure, things like that, quality measures. And we've had great success across the board there. And we have other clients that maybe dip their toe in the value world, but they still operate heavily in the fee-for-service world. And they're maybe more thinking about driving service volumes, especially in a post-COVID world or coming out of COVID, where a lot of those elective procedures have gotten canceled, kind of helping them bring patients back in who are overdue for certain procedures, or maybe even had a scheduled procedure. How do we get them back engaged and rescheduled and things like that have been campaigns that have been successful for us to help clients back and kind of restore some of that activity.
Yeah, and it kind of given, from your description, as you said, so much potential benefit, what kind of barriers or maybe hesitancy do you see when discussing, what could be opened up through, the application of machine learning in this way by systems? Again, kind of what would be their concerns, and kind of how do you get them over that hurdle of understanding that this is going to kind of fit in and enhance operation?
Yeah, it's a big area of focus for us. And I think there's some, maybe a little more art than science on this. We have a couple techniques that we found to be successful. So the first technique is we always try to work backwards. So we don't try to lead with the technology, but we talk about your organizational objectives. And then let's work backwards and talk about how the technology supports that. And so again, we referenced, if you're operating in a value world, maybe you're thinking about preventative care, care gap closure, and things like that. So we want to work backwards from those objectives. If you're fee for service, maybe there's certain service lines you want to drive volume to. So we anchor on that. And then the next thing we found that is really critical is we start to look at the actual interventions. So let's say we have a model that makes some predictions and recommends a pool of patients for certain cancer screenings. We focus on what the actual outreach is going to be, right down to the messaging. If we're using an email channel, we'll actually show some sample content of here's the text of a sample email, here's a visual that might be included, and some segmentation around certain personas that we'll target. And what that does is it tends to cut any kind of fear around, my gosh, well, what if we made a bad recommendation? And what we find is the kind of interventions we're talking about are very benign. They're often messages that focus on the benefits of cancer screenings. There's very little downside if the predictions recommended something to somebody who scored a little bit lower, that it's very safe, and there's very little downside of that kind of more benefit-focused messaging versus maybe other use cases that we don't cover that are much more clinical. We're not making any predictions that get presented to physicians. We think of ourselves as more like matchmakers of, patient, you might be a great candidate, so let's connect you with the health system and your provider.
No, and that definitely makes sense. Kind of as you said, being able to avoid that clinical side. It's kind of my impression is it's enhancing and easing the ability of the care team to actually be able to focus on the best care and delivering actionable insights to those professionals who can then apply their professional knowledge.
Yeah, when we engage with clients, often those first discussions are around strategy. So what are your organizational objectives? How do we help you meet those? How do we use technology to support that? And a lot of times we help them focus on, there are applications of AI that you really need to go slow on. And those that are embedded in clinical workflows and processes. And if you're presenting recommendations to physicians, those you really need to be slow and methodical about. And there are other use cases where you can move faster. And we think patient engagement is one where there's a lot of opportunity to get those proactive outreaches in place, to get started, come up with ways to reach out to patients in ways that the patients appreciate, respect some of their channel preferences. Some patients like emails, some patients don't like emails, some older patients maybe actually appreciate phone calls. and to be intelligent about that kind of outreach.
And I think also, as you're saying, it's by not being on the clinical side and being in a place where the interaction or the recommendation is, comparatively a little bit more benign. It seems like it's also a place where you have that opportunity to iterate, in the real world without necessarily the same, potential dire backlash that would happen if a clinical decision, or a more advanced clinical decision goes in a less than desirable direction.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And maybe to bring it just a little bit more technical, as data scientists, our team thinks about what's the impact of a false positive or a false negative from a model. And in these proactive outreach cases, both those cases, false positives and false negatives, are very benign. Those messages are quite generic, as long as we provide basic filters around this particular screening goes to women between these age ranges, and those sanity checks are in place. Lower model scores are perfectly appropriate to send to a broad population. So what I like is what you hit on, is that it allows health systems to go quicker, to run more campaigns, to do more outreach in ways that are targeted and driven by clinical data, but yet the actual intervention is non-clinical. It's more this proactive engagement and how do we connect people to care.
And it seems like it's also, and I think you've also made this point, it allows for a more immediate impact. So it's almost surprising that, interventions using machine learning in this vein don't get the same amount of attention as those, more clinical, potential applications where there's a lot more uncertainty, I feel, and a lot more concern, and also that, by moving in this direction, you can actually create a place where you're providing an immediate benefit and not, creating, kind of that overselling of the capabilities.
I think that's right. And the other dynamic we see is in many other industries, outbound marketing is a bit shunned and annoying, and we all had the experience with bad telemarketing calls or spam emails. And I think healthcare has a massive opportunity where for a certain pool of patients, that proactive outreach about your health could actually be really beneficial and appreciated. I think it's a rare case of, if done well, if done respectfully, if done intelligently, patients would actually appreciate that proactive outreach. If my health system is contacting me about risks that I have and concern and wanting to get me to care, I'm actually going to appreciate that if done well.
No, that's a great point. It's, as you said, it kind of helps to reinforce that, that trusted relationship between the care team and the patient, where, because it, I think, as you're implicitly saying, it makes the patient feel that they're really being tracked, and that, the clinicians that they're working with are invested in their health, which, I think by and large is true no matter what. It's, but how can you kind of enhance and reinforce that impression?
That's right. It's sort of the they know me type scenario of they do have a lot of data about me. They know my medical history. And if they're proactive about it, it's heartening to me. I think there is that human connection. And we talk a lot about the combination of, this fancy AI and machine learning technology, but we don't want to lose the human connection. And how do we balance that in the right way? Providers are so busy, they don't have time to go and, call patients about things that may be more preventative. But if there are ways to use technology in a smart way to augment the providers and kind of deliver patients at the time that care is relevant, that's a win both for the patients and for the providers.
Yes, no, I think enhancing efficiency and automating tasks where appropriate is an easy way to appreciation on all sides. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Joe Schmid from SymphonyRM, and we've been talking about application of machine learning to patient engagement. And Joe, I'd kind of like to pivot a little bit and turn into maybe a little bit more the nuts and bolts of the operation of the systems. And you referenced early on, the fact that there is, these troves of data within healthcare. So, have you seen any challenges, or kind of what are the concerns that you have in both being able to access that data and then be able to filter it?
Yeah, it comes with a lot of challenges, and for anyone who's even been at all close to data in healthcare, they have a sense for how challenging that is. There's a lot of legacy systems. There are a lot of siloed systems in healthcare. And so even just getting your arms around all that data has huge value, but is really challenging. I think I saw one nice way to summarize this, and it was sort of recreating an initial kickoff, project kickoff meeting, and the vendor is presenting and saying like, all right, we're going to train all these fancy machine learning models. And as step one, we're going to collect all your data in one place. And then we're going to, run these algorithms. And the client is like, wait a minute, you're going to get all my data in one place? You could stop right there. Like that, even that is amazing. And so it is a really challenging environment. We've invested years of work in kind of these data pipelines, just all the plumbing of how we bring in that complex EMR data and augment it with data from other systems like payer care gap files and claims data, and to get that into one large data warehouse, and then to prep that data for machine learning. And how do we do that in a relatively productized and standardized way? It's taken us years and years to get to the point where we are. But the good news is we've invested a lot of that work. We can now get a client up and running relatively quickly. We've worked with the major EMRs, the Epics and the Cerners and things like that, in that clients can leverage those investments. And I think in general, across the industry, we're seeing there has been a lot of investment in data plumbing and AI. And so we're starting as an industry to leverage those investments.
Yeah, I suspect you're vastly underselling the amount of work that went into having to figure out how to access and then collect all those different data sets. But in thinking about that, were you finding issues around standardization or other ways of kind of aligning it to make sure that the same information wasn't being unduly repeated or duplicated, or otherwise being able to align in I don't know if consolidate is the right word, but be able to have the sets of data from different sources all work together.
Yeah, and you could go through almost every aspect of data cleaning and prep that you could imagine applies to healthcare to the nth degree. And so we've had to cover both data cleaning aspects, like messy, missing, incomplete data out of ranges, blood pressure values that make no sense, like 1,000 over 500, and you name it, just on and on like that. And how do you do that in a way that you can standardize all that data? You're right. There's a massive amount of work and investment. I think if there is kind of a hope in this area, I think the data world is making huge investments on tools. There's some great open source platforms that we've leveraged, but that doesn't solve the whole problem. We also need a lot of clinical expertise, especially around as we label data to train these machine learning models, telling the system what constitutes a good example of a bariatrics patient or an ortho knee patient or a breast cancer patient is really complex. And so we have to take that domain expertise and embody it in ways that can be mapped to the data, and then models can be trained and tested and evaluated. There's a ton of complexity in there.
And actually, kind of building off of that point, do you have challenges in ensuring that data sets are broadly representative, so as to not unintentionally include implicit bias or other disparities?
Yeah, this is a really important topic, and we could spend our whole time just talking about this. We've invested a lot over the last several years to make sure that we're thoughtful about the ways we address bias. A couple of key points that I really want to emphasize. I think organizations need to think holistically about bias, and that covers the whole end-to-end process, not just the data sets and machine learning models that might get trained on those data sets that have bias embedded, but the ways that those data sets get put into practice, those model recommendations, recommend groups for outreach. You may have to take steps to mitigate that. And I think if there's any learning that we've found is that it's really critical that organizations embed that throughout the process and the product, and it not be sort of an afterthought. And let me give a few just concrete examples. You want to make sure you're measuring your data set that you train on for composition by race and ethnicity. And it would be no surprise to find that certain groups have lower access to care than other groups. So that means a lot of the data sets that we train on already start out with a fair bit of bias. And if we didn't take steps to address that, we would be amplifying that bias, meaning we might be recommending certain outreach populations would be heavily skewed towards, say, white patients, and we might be underserving patients who traditionally haven't shown up in those data sets. So you really do have to be careful and thoughtful about how you approach that. We've had some great collaborations with the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, has an applied AI center. They focus heavily on bias and fairness, and we've been collaborating with them to kind of measure some of our techniques, get their feedback, refine that. It's a big, important area. We're excited to help contribute to that. And just the last point on this topic, we've committed to do a lot of our R&D work in the open in this area so that we contribute to the community and sort of further the whole industry's efforts around addressing bias in healthcare data sets and machine learning.
And kind of, as you said, being able to help advance and address the bias in the data sets, I think as you're describing, it's one aspect for you on the technology development side to recognize it, but you also need to have the commitment from the organizations that are actually collecting and generating the data, because you're not going to be, that's really not your business, but you're kind of relying upon that as a feeder to then kind of do the next bend of the loop.
Yeah, that's well said, and that we really do work on behalf of our clients, primarily health systems, and we are there to support them. A lot of times they can't change the composition of data sets that are available today, but they can be thoughtful about the outreach. And to give you some specifics, one thing we often do is recommend doing outreach to underserved groups that appear at lower rates in populations that maybe our models recommend. So sort of mitigating some of that bias and trying to overserve the underserved, maybe is a shorthand way to say that.
Yeah, and it almost seems like that could be, even without necessarily maybe the hard data backing it up, it sounds like you might be able to extrapolate it out and, as you said, try to over-target that underserved population, since from the modeling, you might actually determine like that's an appropriate way to go, just because if you're comparing different populations in emerging evidence, it supports the arguable oversell on one direction.
Yeah, that's right. And I will say on this topic, our clients have been very open to these kind of conversations. They've been incredibly supportive. And I think it's all in the spirit of wanting to do the right thing. And so I think that they've been very open to this.
And so kind of thinking about, as we were just talking about, the disparities, and then also, just the beginning part of the conversation around the opportunities for engagement, how do you see solutions, that are focused on the patient engagement side helping the healthcare industry kind of emerge as, we're hopefully getting to a stage where COVID will at some point start trending down and no longer be, the dominant issue within the industry and really just the world?
Yeah, we can think about it in two phases. There's kind of a tactical, acute phase of schedules have kind of gotten blown up through COVID activity, and how do we get back to kind of regular operations? And the great thing is proactive outreach is a great way to accelerate that. So rather than kind of happening organically, we can help customers run campaigns and do outreach to really fill up those schedules quicker. And we've done a bunch of that. We'll see that trend continue to accelerate. And there's great ROI around doing that kind of outreach. And then the second phase is more of a longer term steady state. What we see is clients can start to think about their target capacity and where they have available capacity or where they want to invest in perhaps hiring surgeons or physicians. We can help smooth out some of those capacity ups and downs all through proactive outreach. And I think the one trend the industry will move to is traditionally they've been in kind of a onesie twosie campaign mode where October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so we're going to run a breast cancer campaign. The next month is bariatrics, and so they're going to do that. And I think that model will actually shift so that these campaigns are constantly running. We're looking at which patients are eligible for communications according to their preferences and policies, and then we're sending out the most appropriate message, or in our terms, the next best action for that particular patient. And the messages are customized and tailored to each patient.
Yeah, no, I think, as you said, having ongoing campaigns as opposed to one-off at various points of the year, just kind of also feeds into a lot of the newer discussion around, whole person care and holistic management of concern, or not concerns, but holistic management of keeping people healthy, as opposed to, just looking at episodes of care and just having the system accessed when people are having a specific need.
Yeah, and I think that fits into a trend. Sometimes we hear it described as the consumerization of healthcare, and there are non-traditional players like the Walmarts and the Amazons that are coming towards this space, and we're seeing them focus on what's the patient experience. They do that really well in other industries, and I think it's healthy in that it pushes healthcare as an industry to think a lot about that patient experience and some of the always-on engagement and interactivity.
Yeah, and kind of the comparison to more consumer-oriented organizations also gets back, it doubles down the point that you're making of that ongoing engagement, because those companies are all about getting people to come back and be repeat shoppers on, if not a weekly basis, a daily basis at times. So kind of, as you said, adopting kind of that more of that mindset within healthcare can just create a positive feedback loop, I think.
Absolutely. And of course, the other thing we see in those industries is a heavy use of data and some of the AI and machine learning technology. And I think in healthcare, we have the opportunity to learn from that and apply it not in the same ways necessarily, but in ways that are tailored to healthcare and that are respectful of patient preferences and knowledgeable about their health history.
Yeah, no, and I think that that last point you made is one to pay attention to, which is to not think that you can just replicate what works and what in the general consumer world and translate it over into healthcare. I think it is necessary to recognize that there are distinctions between the different industries that, as you said, require tailoring of solutions. And I think it's very easy for people to just run ahead or run rampant with speculation of saying, "Oh, this," for a while was saying whatever is going to be the Uber of healthcare. But you really do have to think about how does this industry operate differently, and how, I think, as you've been saying, make it fit seamlessly within a workflow.
Yeah, and we see that in our work on the engagement side of the world, where there are a lot of solutions for marketing analytics in other industries, and none of those are aware of the clinical aspects. And if your predictions around what kind of outreach to do are not informed by the patient's health history, you're going to miss the boat. There's going to be context that's relevant to that patient that you're not going to include in your outreach.
Yeah, no, and Joe, believe it or not, we're already almost out of time. So what I'd like to do is ask you one closing question, which is, what has been the most surprising use case for machine learning that you've seen in healthcare?
Yeah, I think for us, and we referenced it earlier, I think in AI and healthcare, those high-profile use cases that everybody kind of comes to mind quickly, or especially around imaging and tumor detection, are top of mind. But I think what we found is there's incredible ROI, both in terms of benefit to the patient and to the health systems, for using this technology for proactive outreach and engagement. And that data that's sitting in the EMRs, mostly unused for years, is really predictive. So we can give really relevant messages to patients and be proactive and get them engaged with the health system. And we're seeing just tons of return already, and we're only scratching the surface. I think that will pick up and it will get a lot more attention as we go.
I think that's a great insight. And as I said, believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Joe Schmid, for a great conversation today.
Thanks, Matt. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.